Hello, I'm Humperdinck Jackman, CEO of ESG Pro, and I'm joined today by Joe Gallagher, our Partnerships Director, and we're going to be discussing carbon reporting, or GHG reporting as you might know it. Joe, there's so many obligations on businesses of every size out there. What are you finding are the real pain points? And let's explore how every business, regardless of size, needs to prioritize their sustainability reporting. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I'm seeing trends where you've got the regulated companies, those that, in the UK would have to submit their emissions reporting into Companies House. So, and then I'm seeing on the other end of the spectrum, the SMEs that are not regulated to share the data. But if they've got clients that are regulated, then it becomes a priority for them. So I think there's challenges in different camps, Humperdinck.
And Joe, there are so many acronyms. I mean, we've got GHG, greenhouse gas reporting. We've got SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, and the list goes on, and it's bewildering for most people. How do we break down all of these regulations into something which the newcomer to the field, they've been tasked to do this? How do we break it down for them? Where do we begin?
Well, there are shifts where I believe there's going to be some more global standardization on certain things, but it is a minefield of jargon. And I think the SME is really struggling initially just to think about, how do we get started? It just feels like a huge challenge. And dare I say it, they don't have the resource. Often they're limited with the time, and they just get scared, and that fear leads them to some of them not acting, which is a real shame.
Well, let's start with the common denominator facing most businesses, the driver which causes those panicky phone calls, even on Boxing Day this year to me. Hey, we've put in a tender, and we've been blocked from progressing it, and the deadline is next week. We've submitted, and now we've got to deliver a PPN 06.
Yes, well, if the PPN one now, the new version as of February this year, the 006, but essentially, whilst that's very much focused on public procurement spend and access, I'm seeing a lot more larger companies now embedding similar things within their RFPs, and the weighting, the low numbers 5%, the high numbers probably 20% attributed to sustainability reporting. And that goes beyond carbon, embraces the full ESG spectrum. But for today, we're talking about the carbon element. And to me, the biggest thing I think companies, organizations want to see is your commitment to a net zero journey. And what they're looking to see is year-on-year improvement, which the PPN 006 just frames it as a carbon reduction plan. But essentially, even if it's not a PPN 006, you can still build a carbon reduction plan and have the confidence to share that and make it public. And you're encouraged to put it on your website. So it's actually there visibly for stakeholders to see.
And I think this is a really important point you've just brought up about the net zero target. There are businesses out there, consultancies, delivering carbon reports, but they're not actually framing it in a useful way. Here's your total carbon emissions, or at least those which are reported. But then they're not identifying which specific GHG, greenhouse gas protocol, emissions categories are included. It's random wording. And this doesn't help anybody, but equally, it means that these clients have invested in a carbon report, which then doesn't help them with public procurement or fulfilling the precise requirements of those tenders, let alone certifications such as B Corp or EcoVadis. And there's a problem there. So once we've got this PPN carbon reduction plan prepared for a client, what's the next step which they might be subject to? What if they're a somewhat bigger company, say over £36 million turnover? What are they facing?
I think from a mandatory point of view, Humperdinck, they could really focus on scope 1 and 2 and maybe look at things like business travel. But the Procurement Act demands 5 categories of the 15 in scope 3. And the big focus area at the moment. Any company, organization who is looking to be net zero needs to get into the purchase goods and services. We know from the work that we've done, it could be 40 or 50%, if not higher, of the scope 3. And it's also the hardest category to have a direct influence over, because you need to encourage and work with your suppliers to make improvements, with their product and the impact of the product and service on you as a company. So I'm definitely seeing a shift for larger companies looking to engage with their suppliers, collaborate, raise awareness, and really try and influence them to do things differently, which reduces the emissions impact on them.
Very important to complete a supply chain ESG sustainability audit on your supply chain, again, for compliance with all of the major ESG frameworks. Like I said, you've got the GRI, B Corp, EcoVadis. These are now fundamental requirements of these frameworks to have good reporting. So the larger businesses, though, they're faced with SECR, or sometimes referred to as SECR, as a new abbreviation, new way of saying it. There's a big disparity between what the larger organizations are required to report on to comply with their when filing their annual report, and the PPN, which applies to any business, no matter how small, in the public procurement supply chain. What can you explain about the SECR reporting, and what works, what doesn't, and what are the risks?
I think, to be quite frank, I think it's incredibly basic, and I see a lot of organizations that will do it themselves and just convert, and dare I say, they may make a mistake and only convert one of the emissions factors, but they can sort of get by doing the mandatory stuff. I'm not going to say that it's just ticking a box, but it might feel like that. But these companies are responsible for a lot of the impact. So they need to effectively set the momentum and drive the change and influence some of those non-regulated suppliers that maybe depend on that relationship. So I think there's a lot of responsibility. And I think the PPN 006 is actually more demanding. So for an SME to complete a PPN 006, I think is more demanding than potentially a large organization to do a very basic SECR declaration.
But the tide is turning. I've been seeing this a lot recently. Clients have come to ESG Pro, and you've helped more than a few of them, where their auditors have turned around and rejected the box ticking minimum, do the bare minimum, report on scope 1, scope 2, and business travel. And their auditors are rejecting the report because it introduces liability on the auditors. It's not transparent. It's not full disclosure. This risk mitigation aspect is very important. So for those businesses, you've already touched on Scope 3 Category 1 reporting, which is your purchase goods and services. What are the other types of emissions which any business really should be reporting on if they're going to be taken seriously, and if they're genuinely going to work towards mitigating their impact on the environment?
I think one that I think it should be mandated is waste. I think it's a very emotive topic, has a big impact, and waste currently is voluntary. And I feel that should be mandatory. I think employee commuting, whilst it has its challenges, is again trying to potentially come up with ideas and initiatives as a company to encourage cycling to work, walking, public transport, but just raise awareness. And if you're doing that with your employees, then hopefully that'll translate into actions they take at home and with their families and their friends, not just around commuting, but the subject of sustainability. And of course, people that are moving products, in and out to consumers, they really should be addressing, upstream and downstream, transportation, logistics, warehousing, and areas like that.
Yeah. And I recently was working with a very, very large global charity on this. A lot of what we did with this client was work on the internal culture, and it's much misunderstood. Very seemingly trivial initiatives. I mean, it's analogous to the the ban on plastic straws in the UK and other countries. It's not that plastic straws themselves represent some colossal tonnage of plastic and waste, or even the energy which goes into manufacturing them. It's instilling into everybody's minds that small changes make a difference. And if everybody in the organization understands on a very personal level how carbon is important, then they're much more inclined on a business level, organizational level, to participate and come up with ideas and identify initiatives, wasted energy consumption and so on, which drive down the big picture. What do you think?
Absolutely. And I think sometimes, right or wrong, organizations can do the carbon accounting without directly involving their employees. Whereas with ESG, as we know, it's far more immersive. It needs to be broader, deeper, wider. So I think with carbon very much and GHG emissions, very much there's an opportunity, I think, to drive change and behavior through people. And if we look at, I know sometimes people talk about, the cost of a kilowatt as an example, and, the cost of living crisis. Well, it's not rocket science, some of these things. If you switch the lights off completely, and you don't use kilowatts, there's an impact on savings. So there can be some initiatives which help people at home as well. And, the new EPC regulations for buildings, on renting out properties. So people can drive those changes to actually impact themselves personally as well as the company they're working for.
Interesting points. Now, one of the things which comes out of that part of our discussion is the differentiation for larger businesses, large undertakings. There's this regulation ESOS, the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. So let's help everybody understand the difference between ESOS and what it's trying to achieve and carbon reporting under, say, SECR. Would you like to go there?
Well, not. I suppose, is carbon a currency? I suppose in this example, let's assume it is a currency. ESOS is using kilowatts as its currency for reporting, and GHG emissions is using carbon. So, companies doing their SECR would need to convert their kilowatt usage into carbon emissions to help them with that reporting. But that's essentially in my opinion, the sort of the key difference.
And fundamentally, they're both about saving the organization money. ESOS very, very much. If the organization uses less energy, it saves money. It's an incentive, a methodology to identify your energy hotspots and your opportunities to reduce. But with carbon reporting, I always put it as everything which you put out, everything you consume in the business, everything you send to waste, landfill, is money. And it's also carbon. So carbon reporting is also about reducing your waste, because that's carbon. And if you purchased a product in the first place, everything you send to landfill is not just carbon going out of the door, it's money. So it becomes, there is the opportunity for businesses of every size to make their carbon reporting journey self-funding.
Absolutely. And I think the point we haven't talked about is that impact on things like air quality. So, if you can combine reduction in carbon emissions with reduction in cost, with reduction in, or air pollution, which improves the air quality. And I think certainly in those heavy urbanized areas, there's a lot of focus now on initiatives to drive that down. I know in London, I read a statement from the mayor, which talked about 4,000 premature deaths every year linked with poor air quality. So that has a direct impact on everybody that lives within London. So it's often overlooked, but certainly that's
in the paper this morning, in the Telegraph, it highlighted, the journalist highlighted how the air quality in Paris has improved fourfold in 20 years, which is incredible.
Yeah.
So let's dig a bit deeper here. I mean, what's the process when we start really digging we face the elephant in the room, which is purchased goods and services, most businesses, when they first start this process, they think it's all about their electricity and fleet fuel purchased. But every business buying goods and services is buying carbon. It's part of. So if we can drive that down, then we're really onto something. Statistics vary, 92, 96% of any business's carbon footprint is derived from those areas, those emissions categories outside of their direct control. All of this so-called Scope 3. And the overwhelming majority of that is in purchased goods and services. So as we start working through the client's purchased goods and services, we're not just identifying how much carbon they're buying, we're also identifying spend hotspots where they're using the wrong or the inefficient supplier, not necessarily the best price. They're just buying from here and from there. It's out of control, which opens the door to really make some profound savings.
Yeah, absolutely. I know sometimes the larger companies, they struggle with engaging the supply chain is sometimes as basic as the database and the information they have to communicate with them, having that at the beginning. And then I think when you're looking at carbon emissions, it would make sense to do that under the sort of overall strategy of ESG risk assessments, and then embody within the risk assessment some questions that talk about, what are you doing around your carbon emissions? Have you got a reduction plan? Do you report or record it? And really, I suppose then, initially with the Scope 3 purchase goods and services, as we know, the team initially worked with spend-based data, which is at the moment the science that many use. But over time, and the quicker the better, it will move to actual data as opposed to spend-based. And I would hope to think that the emissions reporting or the amount will come down once you use actual versus spend-based. And then really what I'm also then seeing is companies wanting their SME suppliers to make climate pledges on the reduction year on year. And that's sometimes linked with if they've got a shareholder declaration to say science-based targets, we're going to take 30% out of Scope 3 in the next 5 years. You can't wait to 2029 and then announce that you've missed it because you've not been checking in with your suppliers over the year on year. So that again is another challenge, but I'm definitely seeing a trend to companies wanting to do that.
Absolutely. And something we're working with our clients on is actually helping them engage with their suppliers, because you've got to bring the suppliers on board. And a lot of times suppliers, you don't have, well, you might have direct and somewhat personal contact with several of them, but overall, everybody's feeling a bit bombarded with RFQs and assessment this and assessment that. So what we're finding is helping our clients conduct webinars for their suppliers to bring them on board, explain the journey, and get them engaged. Your suppliers are absolutely your weak link. And this process of us actually helping organize or hosting these webinars is really creating some great motivation and participation. What else could suppliers be doing?
Well, I think under the spirit of collaboration, I've never known a subject in my working career where it brings together customers, suppliers, partners, competitors. I've never known a subject, and everybody really wants to learn from each other. So I think there's a really huge opportunity. And I think, I suppose in my mind, sometimes I talk about eliminating the benefit of hindsight. Why wait 18 months and then find out you've gone down the wrong? Because we haven't got the 18 months or the 2 years. We need positive action as soon as possible. But I think for SMEs, there's never been as good an opportunity to access things like the procurement frameworks, 400 billion spend a year with a KPI from the government talking about 30% award to the SMEs. So there's never, ever been a better time to stand up, lift what you're doing and access that sort of a huge potential pot of expenditure.
That's good. That's a very good point. The other thing I think we need to really face up to, for anybody watching this video, is the big debate over net zero, has become a very strong political baton right now. Either for it or against it. You're for business or you're against business. And I think what we're really trying to deliver here is the message that set aside the politics of net zero. The climate is changing. That's a fact. Is the UK's strategy the best? I'm not going to make a comment on that. But what I do believe is that these very points you've been raising about giving SMEs absolute access to public procurement, and take the example that by the NHS's own reckoning, there are somewhere in the order of 80,000 direct suppliers in the UK. Now, the overwhelming majority of those are small businesses. And the NHS demands that those small businesses are assessing their supply chain. So assume 20 per supplier. Very quickly you're into millions of UK businesses subject to these regulations, and it's absolutely fundamental. If you want to supply the NHS, you have to have a carbon reduction plan, PPN 006. And this really is coming together for businesses. And just touch back on that whole tender situation. Such a small business I dealt with personally, they make wigs, both for the public and for the NHS. It's about 50-50 revenue. They've been a supplier to the NHS for over 10 years. Suddenly, they couldn't submit their tender because there was an absolute block until they complied with NHS Evergreen, the first stipulation of which is carbon reporting. Then map that back to the Procurement Act, and there's opportunities galore for everybody. It's not about the politics, it's about the impact, and it's bottom line impact on the business who gets their own house in order. But also its reputation. What about, the importance of every business to be able to shout to consumers and business suppliers that they are taking the environment seriously? Any thoughts there, Joe?
I think the percentage of eco-conscious decision makers and consumers is changing, yeah? And so I think I can see in certain retail examples, hospitality examples, where people make decisions about where they go to eat, where they shop, what they buy based on various sort of eco labeling, or how the restaurant is sourcing its food, and that's only growing. So I think if you don't really tune into that, you're narrowing your market over time. So whereas some of might have said, Joe, that was a niche 5 years ago. Well, actually, that niche is really growing now, so it's becoming quite a large percentage. So I just don't think you can overlook it. You talked earlier about net zero and this sort of fear which I do see fear from SMEs about making a statement. I always say, well, if you're making a statement to net zero, it should be a lot easier for you to achieve it than it would be for a much larger organization, a city, and or the UK as an entity. But I think the way that certainly I try and help is make sure they're really clear about what they're saying. So if they're saying we're going to be net zero by 2030, and that's their operational impact, that really they share that is really focusing on just operations and scope 1 and scope 2, but the full scopes are going to be maybe 2040, 2050 more long range. Because I see some SMEs making mistakes where they're overstating what they're saying, and that, as we know, is greenwashing, which would switch somebody off straight away. And then I think the work we do, even for the larger companies, I often get met with a little bit of resistance on scope 3 reporting, because they're worried about showing their emissions have actually gone up, which they could go up by sort of 9 times the figure once you get into scope 3. So again, what we try and do is make sure that we measure the intensity metrics for scope 1 and scope 2, and that's a separate measure. And then we do the full intensity metric based on all scopes.
Then able to help every business compare apples with apples.
Absolutely. I see that as quite a simple method, but it actually eliminates what is, I think, quite a big fear for large companies, because they know that elephant in the room is scope 3. not just from a data, collecting it, managing it, who's going to do that, the time that's needed, the cost if they're working with an external party. But it's just this perception that it's going to look really, really bad. Actually, I think it's the complete opposite, because it shows that you are really attacking the big challenge, and you'll get a lot of respect from that, from many organizations. And I think for the SMEs, again, it should be quite easy. And as we know, we normally focus on 50 to 75% of where we see the impact. But there's no huge gain in focusing on a low spend in a low impact area. But, it's focusing on those large impact areas.
Okay. Yeah, just a thought from me on what you've been covering there is study after study for the last 15 years has shown that consumers will spend anywhere from a 4 to a 9% premium for products and services deemed sustainable. And you only have to go onto booking.com or any major travel platform these days to see the impact. Every hotel leading the charge to say, look, this is our carbon footprint. This is our social perspective. This is how we are managing our own business. And that's, incidentally, it's the hotel industry where the whole concept of greenwashing was conceived. Now, I think it's time to probably start wrapping up. So my closing thoughts on this whole topic of carbon reporting come down to brand messaging. No matter what your business, whether you're going for B Corp certification, EcoVadis certification, which is more for business to business, but what do you actually have to shout about on social media and in other forms of advertising? What is your corporate presence out there? And nothing speaks louder to the current population than sustainability. So carbon reporting, to my mind, is absolutely the starting point. It's where anybody who professes to care at all for the environment should begin. And you can make a positive impact. It's not for you. Each business, no individual business is going to solve the climate issues out there, but collectively, clean air, lower waste, these make a difference. And this is where I think every business does need to get on board, do it right, get some proper advice, and be guided by experts, not with some piece of software trying to struggle through all of these concepts on their own.
I think there's an opportunity potentially for the companies to redefine themselves with new purpose and values, and that new DNA could be wrapped around the subject of ESG, which, as we know, embraces carbon reporting. I know you mentioned earlier on around the accountancy firms rejecting, the auditors rejecting declarations. And I think as the non-financial information grows within companies' reports, that environmental, we haven't even talked about the other major challenge at the moment, which is the climate risk modelling, which I'm expecting the new ISSB to potentially replace the TCFD, but it's going to put pressure on those large companies to not only do the climate risk modelling, but actually position it from a financial impact on their business. A huge challenge. But I think then, if you're paying for the annual auditor, if you can work with an organisation, hopefully like ourselves, who can help prepare the data so it's audit ready, that should reduce the amount of audit fees you pay because it's presented in such a strong and compelling manner. So I think there's benefits all around, but I think for sometimes people just need, what is their key drive? What is their reason to act? I talk to some people and it can be, listen, Joe, I've just got 2 new grandchildren and I want to protect the planet for their benefit when I've left. So sometimes it can be a human link like that. Other times it's, regulation. Sometimes it can be tenders and bids, key customers. But ultimately, I think, it may be a multiple of different drivers that can bring everybody together.
That's brilliant. So bottom line is carbon reporting helps your business, helps your family, helps society, helps the planet, and it's got to be done. Thank you very much for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
welcome your questions. Come onto our website, use the contact form, book a meeting,